I'm Greg, and you're listening to Totally Preventable.
Totally preventable.
Totally preventable.
Totally preventable. Totally preventable.
Totally preventable. Totally preventable.
Today we have the United States Drug Testing Labs on. This is going to be great.
Sounds serious.
Doesn't it? See, we're getting big time here.
It does.
It's not, the Portsmouth Drug Testing Lab.
Nope.
It's not the New England Drug Testing Lab. This is the United States Drug Testing Lab. You're only going to see it here on Totally Preventable.
Yep.
It is big. We have Guida Brown. She's the community relations consultant of the USDTL. And it's going to be pretty good to see because she's going to talk to us about the different types of drug testing that are available throughout the states.
Interesting.
It is. It's going to be weird. There's more than what I just thought. Like, I'm still old school, but
yeah,
there's far more testing, like fingernails and all other kind of things that she's going to let us in on.
Wow. Yeah, I got no idea about this. I'm very interested.
So it's going to be good.
All right.
It's going to be detecting substances and all other types of things that are these tests are going to unveil. So
I wonder if they can test how many moon pies you've had.
That would be bad. So without further ado, joining us today in our Totally Preventable podcast, we have Guida Brown, Community Relations Consultant of the United States Drug Testing Lab, and also principal of Guided by Guida. Guida, how are you doing today?
I'm really well. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. Our pleasure. To get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a Kenosha native, Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I worked in social services in the nonprofit world for the better part of my life. I worked actually so the how I got into what I'm doing now is that I worked as the executive director of the Hope Council on Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse, which is an agency that provides education, prevention, intervention, and referral services for people who have substance use disorders. And one of the primary jobs at that agency and sort of the bread and butter of the agency was intoxicated driver program planning. So we got every single person who lived in Kenosha County came through the agency's doors who wanted to get their driving privileges back if they were a resident of Kenosha. And we're one of the only organizations in all of the state. We have 72 counties in Wisconsin. We're one of the only organizations that did drug testing of our clients. People, they have a driver safety plan. We say you have to do X, Y, and Z. And far too often the X, Y, and Z remain abstinent. But there was no follow-up to find out whether or not Z actually happened. And so through some meetings and some luck, I was introduced to U.S. drug testing laboratories and said, oh my gosh, we want to be on the cutting edge of this. So that was in 2011. When I was the executive director, I left my executive directorship about a year ago and then became a consultant with the laboratory.
Wow.
Can you tell us more about the lab, what they do?
So the vision of the lab is to protect and enrich lives. And they are primarily looking at making sure that people who have substance use disorders have good testing it's a forensic lab. So they're not doing treatment, they're not doing diagnostics, but they're giving the tools to people who work with those who have substance use disorders to make sure that the tests are reliable, that they're accurate, that they're accountable. Drug testing started with the Vietnam War. And it started with urine testing because there were so many soldiers who were in Vietnam who were using heroin, opioids. And in the United States, so this is like 1974, in the United States, they're saying, gosh, we don't want all those people addicted to heroin coming back here. What are we going to do? So the urine cup was developed. And that became the gold standard. And I will talk about that a little bit more, but it became the gold standard, sort of the expectation of if you're negative on a urine cup or if you're positive on a urine cup, that's the only information out there. And that's what we're going to use. And the truth of it was they were testing specifically for heroin, for opioids. And there's every 6 months, I on social media, I get a tag, hey, Guida, what do you think about this? And it's that addiction isn't a disease, it's a lack of connection. And I, very nicely tell everyone who tags me, yeah, that's an interesting perspective, but there's so much missing in it. And so there's this video that goes with that talks about how we had our own rat park. We've heard about rat park where the rats will take a drug until they die. But if you add other rats to that, then they won't die because they have that connection. And I'm like, well, that's not true. That's not true in that if that were true for humans, if you ever went to a 12-step meeting, you would never have an addiction again, right? Because there's your community. So it's way too simplistic. And I'm not suggesting that community doesn't enter into it, but it just doesn't enter into it to the degree that we would solve all problems if we just had better community. The other part of that, though, is, the narrator who has this beautiful British accent, so he sounds very intelligent on this video. He says, we had our own rat park. It was the Vietnam War. And so our Vietnam veterans came back because they were urine tested to make sure that they didn't have heroin in their system. And so, look, they weren't addicted to heroin. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how are our Vietnam veterans doing, right? They didn't have heroin in their system because they wanted to come back to the United States. So they switched drugs. Addiction is a brain disease. It is not by any stretch of the imagination somebody addicted to one substance. My sister has diabetes, and I always say, she'll never find a doctor who says, hey, you know what, you've got diabetes. Go ahead and eat all the bread you want, but stay away from donuts. Because it doesn't work that way, right?
Right.
No doctor would say, hey, you've got addiction, so stay away from heroin, but drink all you want, because it's a brain disease. It has nothing to do with the substance. And so the soldiers came back to this country and they still had addictions. And we see that every single day with what's going on with that population. So the urine cup was the gold standard. And for a long time, that's all we had. But now we have these brilliant tests that really address substance use disorder. So the gold standard of a urine cup being, what did I do 24 hours ago? That's great. If you want to follow somebody around with a urine cup and figure out what they did the last 24 hours every day, that works. But the lab, U.S. Drug Testing Laboratories, has these just brilliant tests. They test fingernails. We often hear about hair testing. It's the same substance, but fingernails are more reliable across genders and across races, whereas hair is different. Hair in different races doesn't hold the drugs in it the same way. And because women particularly treat their hair in so many different ways, it ruins the core of the hair. So fingernails are the same for everybody. And they hold drugs, they hold alcohol up to 3 months, and other drugs of abuse up to 6 months, with the outlier being marijuana, which can be held, THC, which can be held even longer. And so if I want to know if somebody's using substances, and I'm not talking about Joe Blow on the street who might have a drink every now and then, because I don't care about Joe Blow on the street who has a drink every now and then, right? My population were people who had substance use disorders. And so we knew that they couldn't maintain that sort of white knuckling, reasonable substance use over a period of time. And so we would use their fingernails, and we would test their fingernails to determine were they really abstaining to the best ability. Any test can provide the information for abstaining, because there isn't one. But were they not using to a degree of substance use disorder over the last X amount of time? I love the lab's tests. We have a PEth test, blood spot. that tells pretty clearly whether or not somebody used alcohol, and it's only, the blood spot is only for alcohol, pretty clearly whether or not somebody used alcohol within the last 3 weeks. And again, for my population, the population of impaired drivers who shouldn't be driving their cars if they're going to continue to use, it's exactly the information we needed. The lab also has tests for meconium as well as for umbilical cord. So babies, you can look back about, I think it's about 4 months on umbilical cord to see if a parent used while the baby was in utero. And again, we're not trying to, tests should never be a gotcha. They should never be, you know, we scored a positive test and now you get to go to jail, or you get these sanctions. That should not be what testing is ever for. It should be about helping people. And that's why I love the lab, and I'm sorry, I just can't sing their praises enough, because I just think the tests, they're just brilliant, and the lab is wonderful, and all the staff are fantastic, and they just have great information that I think is really missing in the world of substance use disorder, because there are so many gotchas.
Now, just from that answer, I have so many questions.
I know, I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. And one of the questions, how does it come to the point where you're like, you know what? Forget hair. Let's go for fingernails. Like, how is that discovery made? Like, I would never think that you could tell that I was using a substance by something that I clip like every week and, you know, goes in the trash. I would never think that.
Scientist, and I always love to fall back on that. People would ask me, I'm like, I don't know, I'm not the scientist here, but I think it's brilliant. I know for a fact that they did these tests with UW students, University of Wisconsin students, and Wisconsinites are known for drinking a lot. And so they perfected their tests using the students at the university. I am not a scientist. I have no idea, but I do know that it's a lot harder to rip your fingernails out than it is to shave your hair.
Yeah, that's true.
And so from the perspective of being the tester, it was wonderful when people, the stories I could tell about people who come in and they've shaved their heads and they've shaved and you can actually use hair on a person's body. So they would shave everything and be pretty obnoxious about it. And then they'd cut off their fingernails, but you know what? Your fingernails grow, right? So we'd say, well, come back in 3 weeks, or come back in a month, 2 weeks, whatever, depending upon how fast they grow. And the thing with that is, because you're not testing brand new information, we have people who come in and we look at their fingernails and we think, so the rule is, if you can put a quarter flat on each fingertip, and you can see the white over the ridge of the quarter on all 10 fingers, and it doesn't have to be all 10, but then there's enough sample to test. So we clip it. Well, particularly with women's fingernails, oftentimes our fingernails are just thinner, and especially if they've been treated, if they've had gel on and they're just, worn down. So sometimes we end up clipping people's fingernails. They actually clip them themselves. We end up watching them clip their fingernails into a bag, and then we're like, darn it, there's not enough sample there. We weigh it on a jeweler's scale. Oh my gosh, there's not enough sample. The beauty of fingernails and of hair is it'll grow. Come back in a month, and then we'll be looking at essentially the same amount of time looking back, the look back period. So it's not like, oh shoot, now I can't go out and party tonight. Well, yeah, because you weren't supposed to go out and party tonight anyway. And so we don't care that you don't have any fingernails. We don't care that you don't have any hair. Come back when you grow it back. And so that's seriously just the beauty of it. I have given people some really bad haircuts. And it's a way better to just stand there and watch them clip their fingernails and be like, yeah, okay, clip your fingernails into this baggie, and we've got our sample.
Wow.
What is the mission of the testing lab? Is it to help people with substance use disorder, or do they have a bigger mission? They work with other populations?
Primarily, that is the mission is to use the best science available to provide cutting edge tools for the analysis and evaluation of exposure to alcohol, substances of abuse, and toxins. So it is primarily that population, substance abusing population.
And who's the target audience for the DTL? Is it companies? Is it parents? Like, who's the target audience?
No, so if you go to usdtl.com, you can actually, there are testing facilities that they are connected to. So, for example, in Kenosha County, you can go to the Hope Council on Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse, pay the fees of that agency, and they will send your test to the lab. But individuals don't send the test to the lab. But it's pre-employment to some degree, it's post-employment accident, it's healthcare, a lot of healthcare, it's impaired driving. It can really be anybody, but again, with that focus being substance use disorder population, a population that has a potential of abusing substances. So again, when I talk about like pre-employment, most of us don't care if somebody used alcohol yesterday, right? It's a legal drug. We don't pay any attention to it. But when there's an accident, it becomes more of a concern. We're not going to ignore the alcohol that might still be in somebody's system, especially when you can see, is this regular social use or is this impaired use? Is this somebody who has a substance use disorder?
Is there a facility linked up with the testing lab in every state?
Probably not every state. Honestly, I haven't looked at the thing, but there could be.
Mhm.
And again, that's the beauty of it. So I spoke once at a conference of doctors, and it was about doctors having to be monitored for their own substance use disorders, healthcare having to be. And again, these tests are brilliant for that. I did a presentation a bit ago about the cost. The cost, they tend to be a little more expensive than other tests are because they're looking at a longer window, right? A urine cup, you can get urine cups on the internet for $5. You have to do it every day, you know? So if I have a test that costs $150 and it looks back for 6 months, that's a lot cheaper than a $5 urine cup 365 days a year. So the cost, you really have to get your head around, well, yeah, it's a higher outlay, but it's looking at a bigger window. So I had done this presentation to healthcare professionals who were saying, we need monitoring. And I was like, hook up with any nonprofit. You can find anybody. So anyone can contact the lab and say, hey, we want to offer this service in our community for X, Y, and Z population. At the Hope Council, we had moms who would bring their kids in and say, here, test their fingernails. We had moms and dads who would call and say, can I bring you a sample from my child? And no, absolutely not. No. We also had clients who would be like, my fingernails are really brittle. Can I just cut them off and then carry them in? No. Because we don't know whose fingernails those really are, right? And it's not okay. And again, this is that gotcha. It is not okay to do a surreptitious test, right? You have to let somebody know you're doing a test and what that test is looking for across the board. It's just you're not helping anybody if you trick them into giving you a sample and they didn't realize that you were going to test it for anything.
What types of tests are mostly used when it comes to substance use detection? So do you mean what tests are being... What tests are used? What substances are being detected or... Yeah. Or both, actually. What tests and what substances are being most widely detected? Yeah. So the Department of Transportation still really looks at the big five. So PCP is one of them that is so rarely detected, it's not even funny. Cocaine, opioids, THC, and amphetamines. The lab can go way more than that. So fentanyl now is a huge one that everybody's looking, are people using fentanyl? We're not talking about test strips to see if it's in the drugs. Fentanyl, they can separate opioids like
hydrocodone from heroin. And that's brilliant to me because people will come in all the time and say, oh, I have a prescription. And I said, well, you didn't have a prescription for heroin, did you? Because that's what you're
Wow.
Or we get a lot of that from like the amphetamines. People will say, well, I was prescribed Adderall, and say, okay, but you're positive for methamphetamine. And so the tests can distill down to that, and they're brilliant. They are just brilliant tests. Gabapentin now is a hugely prescribed, widely abused drug that is being tested for as well. I would say the fentanyl is probably the predominant one. And we hear all the time about opioids, and opioids are killing people, 100,000 people a year. Alcohol still kills more in a year, but because it's legal and you don't die fast, people think it's safe. And I am here to tell you that is not the case. It is not a safe drug.
Are you hearing, or can it, well, I'm guessing if it could determine all these other substances, are you hearing anything about xylazine?
Yeah. Yep, we are hearing about xylazine as well now. Yeah.
So that's being detected as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Oof.
Could you tell us some of the biggest myths around drug testing? Do you have some doozies?
The myths, yeah, oh my gosh, right? So
Sometimes.
because I'm thinking so many. Again, the urine test being the gold standard, the be all and the end all, and they're so hard to monitor, right? It's not about just being in the same room with somebody who's providing a sample. It's about pretty much staring at people to make sure that the sample they're providing is actually from them, because of the things that people will do. I have a friend who told me that there was a male patient who had a urine test for drugs, and for some reason they ticked it, and they actually did a pregnancy test, and he came back pregnant because because he had put into his own bladder his wife's urine.
Oh.
Yeah. I know, right? I mean, that's mind blowing. That's mind blowing. So when somebody can come in and just give me a sample of fingernails, right? And I can just stand there and watch it, and then like, oh, you don't have fingernails? All right, we can take your toenails. It's a longer look back period because your toenails grow slower. But yeah, I'd much rather see your feet than anything else. And so there's a lot of that, a lot of the idea that these tests can be got around. And so I have to tell you, when we first started testing at the Hope Council, we had a woman who had come in, and at the time we had some research breaks. So they were doing research, and so we were getting some dollar allowances that let us do testing differently than we do now. But so we were doing PEth tests, the blood spot, as well as the fingernails. And so I assessed a woman. It was her second OWI. I assessed her, and I said, hey, let's go back, and you're gonna have this test. So for whatever reason, at the time, we were all trying to learn. It was brand new. We started in July of 2011, and this was like July 6th or something. And so I had sent her back, and she did her test, told me I haven't had a drink since October. I haven't had a drink. Okay, all right. And her test came back positive. And I said, I called her on the phone, and I said, hey, you have to come in for another test. I was a little surprised. You told me you hadn't had a drink since October, and yet you came back positive. And so she comes walking in, and we're walking back to the bathroom, and she goes, we need to talk. I said, well, we're going to be in the bathroom, it'll be more private there. We can talk about it there. And so she said, they sent me to the Hope Council, and I thought, Hope Council, what a joke. Last time you guys sent me to education, and she had a significant substance use disorder. And I said, yeah, well, we're trying to get better. We're trying to do some testing. We're doing a better job. And she goes, yeah, I come in here now, and I think, CSI. Thank you for noticing. So and it's not CSI. I mean, it's literally, here, cut your fingernails into this bag. We're going to seal them up. We're going to weigh them, seal them up, and send them in. But the fact that somebody's watching her, and I said, our goal is abstinence. And she said, your goal is abstinence. My goal is to keep my driving privileges.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's fair enough. Okay. We never saw her again. She did her testing. She ended her plan in compliance. We never saw her again. And that was such a huge, like, oh my gosh, we helped this lady manage her drinking, if not for the rest of her life, at least for a year during a time when she was not able to before that. And so the tests are beautiful agents to help people manage their own disease. So thinking that they can get around to tests, that's another one of those huge myths. You're never going to get around these lab tests. That urine tests are good, that they're expensive, that these tests are more expensive than other tests. It depends upon what you're looking for. That poppy seeds cause a positive opioid test. They don't. They could cause a positive, presumptive positive. I look at the thing and I go, oh, look, it looks like you're positive. But once you send it to a lab, it isn't positive anymore. And so that still comes up and I'm just, oh my gosh, how are we still saying this,
Yeah, not long ago I was somewhere and they had bagels with poppy seeds and someone was like, no, I gotta pass. And
Yeah, I think we were joking about it at our
yeah,
but
I think I might have been like at a recovery thing or something, and then someone was passing for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, it's test of an employee, and he tested positive for THC, and there is a drug. I believe it's either ibuprofen. I always forget. It's either ibuprofen or Aleve, whatever's in Aleve, and he said, no, I'm on a prescription for that. I sent it to the lab. Yeah, you don't know, you're not positive. So those sorts of, again, if you're using a urine cup and you're not processing the urine cup, you're getting bad information, right? You're getting a lot of false positives. The other thing I will say when dealing with children, I don't think parents should be doing drug testing on their kids. I think once you think you have to drug test your child, that horse is out of the gate. What I do think parents should do is buy a urine cup and leave it on the fridge or on the kitchen table or wherever. So that kid has the opportunity to tell his friends, I can't use. My mom has a urine cup she's going to use on me. Because we have so many people who have ankle monitors, who have OWIs and they have an ankle monitor, a scram bracelet, and they can tell their friends, no, I can't drink. I'm being monitored. Why aren't we doing that for our kids? Why aren't we giving our kids an out like that? That's right. And again, once you think your kid is using substances, that there's, all bets are off on that. But my goodness, yeah, give your kid that opportunity to have a reason why he can't use substances.
We brought a bunch of kids on a leadership convention a few years ago, probably 4 years ago. And in our office, we had a couple urine cups and they sort of showed up and someone said, what is that? And I said, oh, it's a urine testing kit. And within no time, a rumor had started that we were going to be testing the kids before they went on the trip. And we had like 16 kids going or something. I didn't start the rumor, but I never stopped the rumor.
Yeah.
Just let them go.
I mean, I just think it's such a great relief. Like when I was a kid, I was a really good kid. And I was number 7. So I didn't get a lot of attention, but I was a really good kid, so I didn't need it. But I always think about like my friends who were doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And if anyone had ever asked me, like to have that out, my mom, I didn't have a curfew because I was always home before I was supposed to be, probably. But just being able, that's why we give our kids rules, right? We give them guidelines so that to help them, not to punish them. And I really think that that's one of those things that parents could do that would really help the children be able to make better decisions.
Yep. Wow. I'm still thinking about the pregnant man.
Yes.
And wondering, like, did he know his wife was pregnant, or did you announce that you busted him and his wife was pregnant?
That's exactly what the story was. Holy, oh, she's pregnant. Yeah. Yep.
It's like a gender reveal.
You know? There's a whole lot of questions I can go.
I know.
You know, all kinds of things. Wow.
Imagine if he wasn't the
Yes, that's quite the gossip. You know? So how do you determine which test to use? Is it determined by how long someone wants to go back, or is it the client's preference? How do you determine which test?
It depends on the policy. So generally, I mean, at the Hope Council, we used the fingernails for pretty much our baseline test. But then if somebody told us that I haven't had a drink in 6 months and they have a positive test on their fingernails, then the next test would be a blood spot. Because, okay, clearly you are not telling me good information about how long it has been. Let's look at a more recent test to see how recent it has been. I will say, you know, especially with like umbilical cord testing, there's a lot of racial disparity that goes into determining if a person should have a test at all. Now, for us at the Hope Council, it was across the board. Anyone who had to go to treatment had to be tested. That was it. And if you had 3 offenses, you had to be tested more often. If you had 1 or 2 offenses, you had to be tested once. That's absolute policy. And I would support policy over personality every single time, right? But for umbilical cord testing, I am advocating for universal collection of sample. So everybody gets their sample collected. And then if there's a reason to test it, you test it. Instead of this sort of, you know, maybe we'll collect a sample, we'll try, we'll consider it. Depending upon the story you tell me, depending upon the information I can glean, no, collect everybody's sample. Umbilical cord can be tested, can be stored really easily. And it can be stored up to a year. So we don't necessarily know if a neonate is going to go into, if it's going to have withdrawal symptoms immediately. Is it going to take a little bit? You know, we know what opioid withdrawal looks like, but we don't know what all the withdrawals look like, right? So if we wait a little bit, if we have this sample collected, you don't have to worry about meconium, which is the baby's first stool, which is really hard to collect. It's really yucky. And it's not necessarily, there's a lot of quantity not sufficient because you didn't get the whole stool, or because the stool happened at a time when you couldn't even get it. Sometimes it happens in utero. So it's just not, it's not good. Whereas umbilical cord is, it's easy. It can be collected on every single baby, and then it can be stored and held until it's actually needed.
I know for my oldest, meconia came out right away.
Yeah.
You're like, Dad, get on it. And I was like, what?
That, and then urine too. They'll try to do a urine test, and it's like, you know, oh my God, can you know, it's hard enough to do a urine test on a grown-up. I can't imagine trying to collect urine on a baby.
Did you see any upticks in anything during COVID?
So opioids had already been off the rails. Yeah. I will say, we know that alcohol use really ratcheted up during COVID. But the other thing that's been ongoing, you know, is cocaine. And it's pretty odd. I think it's actually a reaction to how well we've done with opioid medication for addiction treatment. Medication for addiction treatment for opioids, Vivitrol, naltrexone, they work on opioids and alcohol. But if I am a person with the disease of addiction, giving me medication isn't necessarily going to resolve my desire to get high, because addiction is a brain disease, not a disease related to the substance. And so we see a lot of people who switch from opioids and alcohol to cocaine because the naltrexone, Vivitrol don't touch that ability to get high from the cocaine. I did an assessment. I do an assessment once a week at the Hope Council just to keep my toe in the door. And I did an assessment the other day, and the person was talking to me. And I was like, hey, it's on cocaine. And I hadn't seen it, like, it just felt like I hadn't seen it since the 80s, right? I was like, oh my gosh. And then I go and I do the urine cup, and we do a urine cup. Simply, this is what I always tell clients. We're simply verifying, we're testing the veracity of your answers. That's all we're doing. We don't send it anywhere. I just want to know how close to the truth were you when you told me you hadn't used in X amount of time or whatever. And so we go and we do the urine cup, and he had told me that he had used opioids, and he was negative for opioids, but he was positive for cocaine. It's like, and it was, to me, he's like, no, it shouldn't be. And I was like, well, it is.
Well, take a nail sample.
Yeah, no, it wasn't even. So I was like, all right, good luck. But yeah, so, and that's a great way to follow up and see, we have clients who want to be tested. It's amazing. I used to imagine people sitting in a bar talking about all the ways they were going to beat our tests at the Hope Council. And in the beginning, in 2011, so from 2011 to 2014, we only tested those folks who had 3 or more offenses. And then in 2014, we stepped up and we said, no, we're going to test everybody. We're going to test everybody who goes to treatment, everyone who has that abstinence order. And so we started testing the 1s and 2s. And it was so funny because we never had any pushback from the 1s and 2s prior to that. But then when we got they all went through their stories about all the things that they, my office used to sit between the door and the bathroom, and I could hear the stories start the second they walked in the door. And I'd be like, positive test alert. They would like, oh, I was sick and I had to use NyQuil. And we're like, no. Your test would not be positive if you were using NyQuil as prescribed. And they would literally say, oh yeah, no, I wasn't using it as prescribed. I was using it to get drunk. Like, well, then you were drinking and you knew you weren't supposed to be drinking any alcohol. Just the stories, oh my God. We had a clinical supervisor who said, we should get like the end of newsprint and write down excuses why they have a positive test by number. And then anytime somebody came in, we would say, oh, sorry, that's number 32. You have to come up with a different one now. Because we had a lot of, yeah.
Now, you've mentioned that you're principal of Guided by Guida, and that's your consultant. How do people get in touch with you? How do people get involved with you? And what type of consulting are you going to be able to provide for these calls or requests?
So as I said, I spent my working life in nonprofits. So nonprofit stuff, grant writing, substance use disorder, training, leadership. In my little world in Kenosha, Wisconsin, I'm a big fish in a little pond, right? But you can't be a prophet in your own backyard. So I just tried to keep my name out there when I left my full-time position at the Hope Council. Unfortunately, people still, oh, that's Guida. She's from the Hope Council. And so that's thus Guided by Guida. I wanted people to know, yep, it's still me. But I do have other gifts that I can help people with. The nonprofit world is where my heart belongs, and the substance use world too. So I have a Facebook page, Guided by Guida there. They can look for me on LinkedIn too, Guida Brown. And then I have a blog, the 4 C's of Addiction, that I just try to get the word out about, what people are going through. And again, addiction as the disease we know it to be. I will say, I think it's the saddest thing. I'm so sorry. The saddest thing in the world is that I had a client one time who had, I want to say he had like 7 OWIs. And I said to him, I looked you up. In Wisconsin, we have a CCAP. It's all public record of any court cases. And so you can look up anybody's name, and if they have any court cases, it shows up with the exception of like two counties that don't put their traffics in. And so I said, I looked you up on CCAP and you have a lot of offenses. And he said, yeah, I've got 33. I said, well, I didn't count them, but you have a lot. And he said, oh, I counted them. I've got 33. And I said, well, would you tell me that any of them were because of your substance use? And he said, ma'am, I'd be lying if I told you any of them weren't because of my substance use. And I said, okay, then do you recognize that you have the disease of addiction? And he said, I don't know if I have a disease. I know I shouldn't be drinking. And I said, oh, okay. Well, if you could look at your life back before you ever picked up and you knew all the trouble it was going to cause you, would you have ever picked up? And he said, no. I said, then are you sick or are you stupid? Mm. And he said, well, when you put it like that, I'm not sick. To me, seriously, that is the saddest case I've ever seen. Here's a man walking around with a chronic, progressive, lethal disease, and he doesn't understand he has it because society says that's not really a disease. That's not really a problem. If you just didn't do that, then you'd be fine. And I am here to get that word out that that's wrong and that people are dying from this chronic, progressive, lethal disease because we as a society are not addressing it. And because we have abdicated our responsibility to one another to say, hey, I notice that you are having negative consequences from your substance use. Here's what I think. But we do that about every other thing, right? If I notice that somebody, and this is cancer, diabetes, you go to the gym every week, and every week you see the same person, and on their back is this mole that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Most of us won't ignore it. Most of us won't it's not my business. It's not my business that person's going to die from cancer. But that's exactly what we do with substance use disorder to people we love. Mm. So my last final example, there was a woman, an anchor in Florida, and she had a lump on her neck, a TV anchor. She had a lump on her neck. And a viewer wrote in and said, hey, I noticed you have a lump on your neck. I had a lump on my neck. It was thyroid cancer. You should get that checked. The anchor gets it checked. Yes, she has thyroid cancer. She gets treatment. She lives. She's grateful. How are we letting people in our lives die from a chronic, progressive, lethal disease because we are uncomfortable saying anything about it?
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
We've had this conversation before. I can't remember who, but how difficult it is to tell our loved ones. And it shouldn't be because we love them, and we'll talk about other issues, but how the perception is that they're going to be mad and fight back, and we might lose them over, even though we might lose them,
Right.
Surprised that so-and-so died of an overdose or whatever because I was the one who didn't say anything, and that's where the 12-step world comes in. I'm not a person in long-term recovery, but that principles over personalities, the ability to say, these are the 4 C's of addiction, right? Control, compulsion, craving, consequences. Let's just look at those 4 things. Let me just point out to you what I'm seeing, as I would with anybody. My sister, again, my sister has diabetes. When her diabetes is uncontrolled, she can turn into a raging lunatic. Mm. And I don't pretend I didn't see it. I say, hey, we've got a problem here. Let's address the problem here. Or, all those people we care about who have other diseases, we don't have any problem with that because, are people going to get mad? Sure. There's addiction is the one disease that comes knocking on the door and everyone pretends it's not there, right? Everyone else, if you had cancer, people are like, oh, let me find the best doctor. Let me figure out how to get over this. But addiction, we just don't want to talk about it. And I think that's a societal problem.
Absolutely.
Wow. That puts a whole different light on things when you say
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. This has been outstanding.
Yeah, it was nothing like I thought it was going to be.
Oh.
No, I mean, I was like, oh, we're going to be talking about like real scientific stuff that I am not going to know anything about. It's going to be super, super good. Like,
yeah. if you had a person from the lab specifically, yeah, some of the scientists like, oh, yeah. So that was what I always told clients. Yeah, I don't know. I don't work for the lab. I don't work.
We love to have fun, and we actually have a new person in the office who said to us the other day, "Oh, I love listening to you guys. You're having fun." And we're not always having fun. We do have a lot of serious topics that aren't fun at all. But it's always good to have one where we can laugh and
Even though it's serious topic,
right? Serious topic, but
talking about addiction and substance use and
Yeah.
serious topic. But I mean, this has been great.
Yes.
Just learning about the labs and the different testing that can be done and how early it can be done. It is great to see the exposure and to start that getting point. And then just the analogy and the stories puts a lot of things in perspective.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. A lot of things that are happening in Wisconsin, I think we could definitely adapt.
Yeah.
If we're or have our community look into what's similar out here. So that's
Thank you for all the knowledge you gave us today, and the giggles too.
Thank you.
Thank you
We
so
appreciate
much.
it.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
You too.
I'm Polly, and you've just listened to Totally Preventable.
Totally preventable.
Totally preventable. Totally preventable.
Totally preventable.